Broadcast is now starting.
Oh, thanks so much, Marina, and to everybody at Charity Village. Oh my goodness, we were just chatting a little bit before, and this is the fourth presentation, and I'm really grateful to be invited each year. I love your group, and you really bring together a wonderful community. So welcome everybody, and I know that Charity Village has been so generous to not only make this available to the not-for-profit sector, but really anybody that wants to hop on. So I want to acknowledge that. I know the majority of people today will be from the not-for-profit charitable sector, but there'll be many others who might come from other sectors, and everybody's welcome, and I think the learning today will be relevant for all. So I won't go too long on my bio and my introduction. You could certainly read lots about me on my website. I'll just briefly share a few quick notes so that for those that are new to me, just have a steer on what brings me here today, and particularly talking about assertiveness. So as I am principal of Big Cheese Coaching, and I do a lot of stuff in that. I coach leaders. I do a lot of career coaching. I'm very big on emotional intelligence, and just I'll back it up a bit. Before I became a coach, I worked in communications, and so I was very big on, the words that we use to make things happen in business, and the clients that I work with, whether it be in the media or talking to other stakeholders. So I think communications has always been a big part of my life. But when I have a very big orientation towards emotional intelligence. I am certified in something called the EQI, but even before that, we're going to talk a lot about EQ as we go along. I was involved in launching North America's first emotional intelligence assessment. So I'm very oriented to that, and I'm sharing that because assertiveness is a part of emotional intelligence. You'll hear me repeat that several times today. And a little bit newer, well, it's now since 2016, but I've been part of a new movement and some additional training around conversational intelligence. And so I think today's discussion around assertiveness really is embraced in both of those areas. You could read more, as I said, about me at my website, and you can see that I've written a book, and I think some of you will be familiar with that from a previous presentation. Feel free to share insights as we go on Twitter, and let's get started. So I want to just dive in and just acknowledge, or with a question, or ask if you've ever had a situation or a moment where you wish you said something, or you wish you spoke up, and for whatever reason or reasons you didn't. Either you said something entirely different, or you said nothing at all. And I think if you're a human being, you probably have to say yes, indeed. I could relate to that, because I think we've all had those moments. But for some of us, or in certain situations, maybe a little bit more often than we would like. And another question is, when you think about people you know, do you know people that seem to have a knack for getting for what they want? They just seem to somehow make things happen, either for themselves or projects or organizations, and yet they're not considered brash or aggressive. So they may not even have bold personalities, but somehow they get things done. So I want you to kind of think about that, and think about people you know who might be like that, because we all kind of have people in our circles, whether it be work and personal, who can in some way be role models or examples. And likewise, you might also know some people who maybe they do kind of get what they want, but they come across as brash and aggressive, and maybe even a little bullying. And that might be very distasteful for you. And I bet you a lot of people who come to a webinar like this on assertiveness hold that vision with a little trepidation. Certainly don't want that to be you. So we're going to be addressing that as we go along. So today's webinar is really going to dig into this whole idea of assertiveness, and I do want to talk, the first half of the webinar is going to be the why and the what. And I think I really want to anchor into why it really matters, because it's not just something that would be nice to have. It truly has implications for your personal well-being, your professional well-being, and organizationally as well. So we're going to get into some details about that. And the what, well, you know, as I mentioned a little earlier, and you'll hear it several times over, assertiveness is not a standalone idea. It's anchored into something much bigger and connected to many other skills, our personal skills and our communication skills. And I'm probably going to highlight a few new things that might be a little surprising. And one of the things I'll just actually prime you to hear it on again a bit later is it's not really a personality thing, folks. So I know a lot of people who are very outgoing and very confident and very social, but who are not assertive at all, and their skills are very low. And then I do know some people who are quite quiet and a little less extroverted, and yet they have very healthy assertiveness skills. So that's a little bit of a myth, and we're going to take a look at kind of why that is and why we need not attach it to personality, and instead we're going to think about assertiveness as a skill that can be learned. And there's not one person on this call. I know we have 1,000 people today on the live session, and we probably have several other thousand. I understand, I think 3 more thousand have registered, so I forgot to say welcome to those who are listening to this a little later. But each of us, and myself included, can always up our game where it matters. Now, the second half, I'm going to start to get into the way, okay, the hows. And this is a big topic, quite frankly, because you'll see it touches on different areas. So today is an introductory session, but I did my best to jam a lot in. But know that there's more, of course, for you. But what I hope you take away from today is in fact some sort of framework for you to think about and start to practice for yourself the different levels and dimensions that will help you start to shore up your assertiveness. And as I said, it's not just the words that you say, it is there's a bigger picture. Okay, so let's move along here. And I always like to bring some people to the webinar, and here are 3 people. They're a little bit fictionalized, but they represent a lot of true stories and individuals that I've coached and met along the way. So some of you will have read about Joe, Max, and Nick in the article that I wrote that helped highlight what today was about. And if you haven't, you can still find that at CharityVillage's website or my website. But I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So Joe, all 3 work at not-for-profit, and Joe was asked, by somebody who a superior, somebody that she would report to, if she could take on just this one extra load of work. And it was a little bit, it was a project that was in a way discretionary, wasn't part of her day-to-day, but there's always projects that, sometimes these do fall into your area of responsibility, and then there's other discretionary ones that might get assigned, and hope that some people will take the lead on a piece or what have you. So she really wanted to say no because she was already at the tipping point of her capacity. Instead, she said, sure, no problem. She knew that people thought she was a great worker. She felt flattered that they came to her. She didn't want to disappoint. Max works at a not-for-profit, and he was given the chance to sit in on a board meeting, and he was growing, up in the ranks a little bit at that not-for-profit, and they were discussing a project that was still very early stages, but the direction that this project was going, Max just thought that there were some issues with it, and he'd had some previous experience that, brought him to that thinking. And he really did want to say something, but he hesitated, didn't feel comfortable, he didn't want to offend anyone, and rocked the boat, and somehow, as much as he wanted to speak up, he stayed quiet. Anik worked for an organization, and somebody had recently left, and it's one level up from her. And she felt that she had proven herself and all the skills, and certainly did have the aspirations and to do the role. And but rather than voicing this, she thought she'd sit back, and she assumed, listen, my work will speak for itself, and hoped and didn't say a word, didn't talk about her aspirations, and didn't talk about her candidate, why she'd be a great candidate for the role to be filled. Well, along came somebody else who did speak up, who was having conversations, and ended up getting the role. All three of these individuals were disappointed with their situations, and more so, they were disappointed with themselves because they didn't speak up. Now, what you didn't read in the article that I wrote, I'm going to fast forward and tell you a little bit about what happened. So Jo ended up taking that extra piece of work, and she really ended up being overly burdened, and it ended up impacting other parts of her work, and there were ripple effects. Not only was she burnt out and starting to really, we all know what happens with burnout and how we feel and our own resiliency, but there were also ripple effects with how people were starting to perceive her, because her mood was a little different, and even her efficacy in normally what she would handle so beautifully, there were some more mistakes being made, and people started to doubt a little bit, and even doubt her judgment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when as we go along, but being able to say no is actually part of an important piece, not just for our workloads, but even how people will perceive us. Now, Max, what happened was the board started to flounder with this project, as he thought might happen. But unfortunately, there was a lot of frustration and time wasted, and what ended up happening was the higher-ups decided to put somebody a little more senior into the room, if you will, for future meetings to try to get them back on track. And Max probably could have, had he spoken up, because he really did have the wisdom. He lost the opportunity to be known and to make a difference, and also to really do some great work for the organization, if only he had spoken up. And as we know, what happened with Anik. So she was still in her job and didn't have the chance to stretch and grow into a new role. Okay, so I think that is something that probably we can all relate to. We've all had moments, so if you can think for yourself, when have you been held back, in work or in life? Today I'm not just going to talk about work, it's also life. We are holistic people, folks. We aren't just working widgets. When have you been held back because you didn't assert yourself? How often do you shy away from voicing different opinions or taking a stand? And when you need something or you want something that feels important to you, do you proactively and directly make requests for it? And a couple other questions. How much credence do you give to your own feelings and views versus those of others? Do you tend to put other people's perspectives ahead of your own in terms of validating them? And finally, how often do you say yes when you really want to say no? Are you addicted to the yes habit? And I say that with a smile. I'll tell you, I actually gave a 1-hour webinar on this many, many, many years ago, because there is a lot in terms of, learning how to say no and learning when to say no, but it is part of the assertiveness habit. So I think it's a really good question to be considering, just to pinpoint your own kind of where you're at with all this. Now, one of the things that people sometimes think is sometimes we are trained, whether it be our upbringing or other ways, but some people are trained to think silence is best if you're a little uncertain. And the more I engage, both in my coaching and in the workshops I give and other modalities, is in conversational intelligence and in emotional intelligence, is that silence is not always golden. In fact, sometimes silence can be downright dangerous and can have ripple effects, as we started to see with Jo, Max, and Anik. And I think those were just a few examples, but really, if you think about this and think of your own life, or think about your career trajectory or your future goals, seeking a promotion or recognition for your work does require you to be leaning in, okay, to assert yourself, to stand up. Building trust is huge. Building your own self-trust, of course, and also having others trust you, not just in your efficacy of getting the job done, but even in your judgment. Does this individual know when their own boundaries? Does this individual know when it's time to say no? And so on. Many of you might be people managers or project managers, and so managing, people on the team, whether you're managing up or managing down, and especially when you're managing up, requires the ability to speak up. And listen, folks, fundraising, that's like a huge part of what you do. I have a very good relationship with an extraordinarily successful organization that raises tremendous funds and does great work in this community. I can't imagine that those people who do the fundraising, and a lot of these people are lay people and they're volunteers, and of course there are others who are professionals, but they really do need to make sure that they're not holding themselves back, because if they did, they would hold back the goals and the mission of the organization. And I know a lot of those fundraising people, and a lot of them are very shy, but they can still make those asks, they can still have those conversations. The work in the not-for-profit sector has a lot to do with advocating, and whether those happen in singular conversations or other presentations or other ways, advocating requires assertiveness. And oh my goodness, there's so many others, of course. Managing diverse views on a board, like Max was dealing with, and as we just heard about Joe, balancing a workload. Ultimately, folks, it's about making things happen. And even if you want to take yourself out of the work example now, and just even it could be at home, or doing a project at home, or trying to get something delivered to you on time. You know how a supplier might say, we can get it to you on Friday, and you know you need it by Wednesday. How do you make that happen? How do you make that happen without being overly brash and aggressive? So we know that it's important.
Eileen, sorry, I'm going to jump in and just interject for just a moment. I think we might be hearing a phone dinging in the background. It might be yours. If it is,
you know what? It's all the tweets.
I wondered if that might be it.
You know, it's great. First of all, keep tweeting, and it's great that people are tweeting. The only reason why I left my cell phone on is in case I lose connection, I won't know. You'll need to text me.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, if you don't mind just maybe turning the sound down a little bit.
How about we do that? I'll turn that down.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. So hopefully that is working better, and if not, we'll turn it off. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, I'm lowering it. Got it.
Thanks, Eileen.
Okay, super duper. Okay, so now I just want to turn it over to you. We all have reasons why we feel a little held back. So maybe you could type into the chat box, what holds you back from speaking up? I'd love to hear what the audience has to say.
Wow, and our chat box is exploding. Okay, let's see here. We've got fear, fear and shame, power issues, waiting for upper management decisions, stronger personalities, fear of being wrong, imposter syndrome. That's a good one too.
Imposter syndrome. Yes. What else?
Yes, feeling unsure of myself, second guessing myself, a lack of confidence, not wanting to hurt or impede others.
That's really good.
Fear of rejection. Yeah, lots of good stuff coming up here in the chat box.
This is really great. And before I get into anything more on that, I actually want to speak very quickly to that. Actually, I had guessed there'd be a few. Oops, sorry if my mouse is moving around. I just have to situate it. I actually intuited guessed a few, but actually I love the ones that came up, because much of my presentation is going to speak to that, about the imposter syndrome, feeling unsure, the confidence thing, and fear of rejection. Now, one of the things that I don't have a slide per se, but I'll say that when we do have those fears of particularly rejection or looking bad, and not getting it right, in fact, a certain part of our brain takes over, and that is the fear brain. I've talked about that in some of my past webinars with CharityVillage. The amygdala, which is sometimes known as the reptilian brain, and what ends up happening is that it warns you with very loud voices. Careful, don't risk it. This is dangerous, and it does close down the higher thinking brain, the part of you that knows better. And so that part of the brain that responds to fear of rejection or not wanting to look bad is actually often coming from the fast brain. It's a very reactive response, and it's not a reflective response. But it's a true response, and we feel that, so we stay quiet. And I want to just acknowledge that they're not wrong responses. They're perfectly human and natural, but they're not necessarily serving us, and they're not necessarily coming from a place that is our higher intelligence, if you will. So what we're going to do as we go forward, I want you to recognize that what we need to tap into is a different kind of thinking that could distinguish between the reactive, judging kind of place that comes from our fear brain to one that comes from the part of our brain that could discern and come from a reflective brain. And that is all comes from the world of neuroscience. And I didn't do a deep dive on this one because I have a lot of material this round, but I just wanted to acknowledge it. So any of those, of course, reasons are true to each one of us, and they're valid, but unfortunately they don't serve us. So we really do need to find ways to work with our brains and work with our minds and work with ourselves and work with others so that we can step up, because the payoff is that, yeah, absolutely, get more of what you want and need, not just for yourself, but on behalf of your organizations. Be known and understood. Garner respect and trust. This is huge. As you saw with Max and Joe, they started to have be seen less than they really could have, and they were qualified. They were perfectly qualified for all three of them, actually, Anik too, but they weren't respected and trusted for their capacity. So I do want to share, we all have that innate capacity, but if we're not stepping up, it might be invisible to others. So assertiveness is about making sure that you're not diminishing your innate capacity. Being valued for leadership ability and potential, as we said with Max, but I will tell you that I've been interviewed a couple of years ago for an article, and it actually did dive into the impact that not knowing how to say no can have on your leadership. And this was a whole article that myself and a few other experts were interviewed on, because that's how big of an issue it is, that it really can impact your leadership. And, make a difference, which is what why you all chose not-for-profit work. And the last two can't be understated, is develop your own self-confidence and self-regard, and ultimately be happier and more fulfilled. I think it's worth its own slide to shout out that when you learn to stand up and you get to be you get to be a more self-expressed, authentic version of you. And I think that in itself is worth so much, because better things happen when you come to the table, when you show up in the meeting, when you come to work as your authentic, more appropriately self-expressed version of you. I'm not saying unedited, but I'm talking about self-expressed, because when we hold back the way Max did and the way Joe did and the way Anik did, and those are only 3 examples, is we are hiding behind something, the fear, and not allowing what they really were. They really were ready for each of the opportunities or needs that they needed to speak to. Now, before we go on, I have to be clear that some of you might say, that sounds great, sure, yes, but I don't want to be aggressive. And I remember one client in particular, he was he was a leader, and some of the things we were talking about was EQ and assertiveness, and he wanted to be able to speak up a bit more and give constructive feedback more and push back on ideas that needed pushing back on. But he said, Eileen, I don't want to be like the guy down the hall. He's very brash. It's just not me, and I will never be like that. And I said, listen, I'm really glad that you said that, because I would never coach you to be anybody but yourself. So assertiveness has nothing to do with you being like the guy down the hall or the gal over there. It is about you being you and finding ways to communicate and speak up, but still be you. And he goes, oh, okay, well then I really like that. Let's dig in. So to make the distinction that if it's not about being aggressive, what is it about? It's about standing up for yourself, making sure your opinions are expressed and considered, but doing it in a constructive and respectful way, and making sure people do understand, so there's a lot of clarity, and that you also understand where others are coming from. Now, what's really important to reinforce before we go further is this is a continuum. This is not something that you flip the lid. This is something that everybody on this call already has innate abilities, and you've already proven it many times over. But you probably have areas where you hold back. So maybe those are areas where you could develop in your own continuum. And maybe you know some things already, and maybe some things not quite yet. But let's all acknowledge that we are all in the continuum, including myself. I could tell you a few things that I need to be thinking about. Personally, some conversations I need to be having that I notice I've been holding back on professionally in some contexts that I won't get into. But I share that because even though I'm teaching this now, it's part of the human experience to continue to grow, and assertiveness is in a continuum. Now, this is the last slide and the last idea before we get into the how. Okay, I want you all to know the how is coming. But I do want to really anchor this idea of assertiveness, so it's not just this little standalone thing. I want to anchor it into the world of emotional intelligence, and it also absolutely is part of the conversational intelligence realm. So what I'm showing here, I want to do a shout out of acknowledgement to Multi-Health Systems, which is the publisher of the EQI, actually the EQI 2.0 now, which is an assessment that assesses emotional intelligence. And I've been using this with clients, not all, but many clients for many, many years. And as I mentioned a little earlier, was involved in the communications around this assessment many years ago. They were the first in the 90s when emotional intelligence came onto the scene. They were the first to actually have an assessment to measure this business of emotional intelligence. Now, what I want to say about emotional intelligence, sometimes called EQ or EI, sometimes people have misconceptions and they think it's a one thing. Oh, he or she is low in EQ, or he or she has great EQ. And that's a misconception, because EQ, as this slide shows, is actually multifaceted. And in this particular assessment, there are actually 15 factors. I won't go through them all today. Maybe another time we can do more on EQ. But what I want to show you is that assertiveness is one of those factors in amongst the 15, and they're divided into groups of 5. So if you can see, self-expression is where assertiveness, has its home, if you will. But every factor interplays with other factors. And so the better your assertiveness is, it might impact, if you look to the left, your own self-perception, your self-confidence, your self-regard, your ability to actualize, and even your awareness. And likewise, whatever self-actualization or self-regard and self-awareness you have, that is going to have an impact on your ability to take a stand, your ability to speak up. And then hop on over to the right, you see interpersonal. Of course, this is going to impact your relationships. So nothing here is standalone. And if you look to the outer circle, all of this impacts your well-being, your performance, your emotional and social functioning. So I thought I'd share the definition that emotional intelligence, according to this particular framework, is the ability to express feelings and thoughts in a way, I can't even read this because I have something hiding here, in a way that is not destructive and sorry about this, I'm fumbling here, non-destructive. And there's 3 elements: the ability to accept and express your feelings, the ability to express beliefs and thoughts openly, even when it's emotionally difficult to do, and finally, the ability to defend yourself and your personal rights without being aggressive. So each one of us, as I said, already has fluency here in all these areas. But I think this is time now for us in the webinar to really dive in, and let's get into more of the how, okay? And let's start to peel the layers here so that we're all convinced, but now we really want to get a little more practical. And so if I were to be working with any one of you or Max or Joe, often what people might come and they say, help me, I need to be assertive. What do I say? They often jump to the communications part, which is tell me what to say. But, I have to say if I told you what to say, and I tend to be pretty good with words at times, you're going to be as good as your last conversation, and you won't really grow your assertiveness muscle and your ability for future. You're going to collect a string of these are good things to say in these situations. I might have done that in the early days of my communications profession before I became a coach and studied all this. But I'd rather you guys have a muscle that you can call on and a range of abilities and a process that you can call on anytime and work it through each time and know that you have the abilities. So the abilities come from the whole array of self-awareness, judgment and discernment, and yes, folks, courage. A lot of you said we feel unsure, we're not sure if we got it right, and so we're going to speak about that. And then ultimately the words, those really matter. So because there's a lot in each and every one of these, and you already have innate abilities, so I'm counting on that. Once we start to bring awareness to each piece, most of you will already know what to do from that. But there also are rooms for development. So I want you to, as we go through the pieces now, just acknowledge for yourself, yes, I can do that, or yes, that's right. That's right. Once I do that, that will make things easier. Acknowledge your innate knowing. And then make little notes of where you feel that you still have room to develop or questions or not quite sure, because that's part of going to be your continuum of learning for you in a very personal way. It's an inner game and then it's an outer game. So the very first part is navigating with yourself, your awareness, establishing boundaries, accepting your beliefs, that whole commitment thing and courage. And I'm going to be walking us through this in some steps. And then it's the outer game, how you actually express all this, the boundaries you communicate to others, and the words and the tone. So this is a huge distinction, and notice that there's arrows. The inner game influences the outer game, what you're going to say, right? So you need to navigate your inner game first, and that can happen quickly and over time even more quickly. And the outer game, we do not jump to the words without figuring out what's going on inside. So I put together a little process here, a little framework that will help bundle this and make it a little bit easier to digest. So these are 5 steps in a way that, as I said, if I was working with Max or Joe or Anik or any one of you, rather than just quickly saying, here's what you said, or tell me what you think you would say, I'd be curious about what is going on in terms of their awareness and what is going on with how they are framing a situation to themselves. What's the discussion that they're having, and that in fact is the first 2 steps. So I'm going to walk us through some ideas that are part of these first 2 steps, and then we'll go to the next. So the first part is bringing into awareness what is not yet visible, and that's why I call it a blind spot. We have a lot of thinking and a lot of dialogues that are happening beneath the surface that we're not even fully present to, even though they are our own thoughts. And that's because part of being a human being, we all do it and I do it too, is we make up stories, but we're not always present to the fact that those are stories and not necessarily truth. I have this little thing, lights, camera, action, because it reminds me of a movie, because we all have an inclination to make movies. And I sometimes will confess that I make film festivals, not just movies. But what's important is that we need to know, when is this a movie and when is this truth? And the reason why I say we do that is, remember I mentioned we have a fast brain? Well, that brain has a need to make sense of things, and sometimes it rushes to conclusions. Because in the olden days, that was safer. If you heard a rustling in the bush, then that that was a hint that this could be like this, a deadly snake in the bush. And that was the movie that was in your head, and it was best to remember that movie to keep yourself safe. Well, in modern day times, we have all kinds of movies, and it's really not, it might feel like it's about safety because, like you guys said earlier, we don't want to look bad, we don't want to be rejected, so the brain operates the same way. The problem is that the brain is not necessarily speaking the truth. So we need to take a look at those movies that we're making up. And if we were to cast the movie, it might be cast with inner critics. Those are the actors, if you will. And the inner critics are within us. We all have them. These are the voices of judgment. So some of you, if you could pay attention and tune in, we all do this, by the way. When I say you, I'm not putting myself above anybody here. When we're not, managing our inner critics, these are the kinds of things it could say. Don't rock the boat. Who are you to speak up? No one will listen anyways. Oh, I hate conflict. It's dangerous. No is bad. Yes is good. I won't be liked. I'll be seen as a you-know-what disturber, and on and on. Those are your inner critics. And when we don't distinguish that these are inner critics, we take them for truth. And guess what? The inner critics end up driving the show, and they end up keeping you quiet or saying yes when you'd rather say no. So what's important is to learn as part of your personal best practices, this is part of emotional intelligence, is to create the awareness and notice when your stress brain has taken over. Notice those moments when you really should be taking a stand, but your inner critics are sabotaging your better thinking. And notice, learn to take some time to discern, is this an inner critic? Is this an exaggerated limiting belief? Or is this coming from the voice of reason? And if you don't do that, basically you're handing the keys to the car to the inner critics. So here's a little exercise that you can take away and practice, and I do this with my clients, I do it with myself, is notice, be on the alert for a situation that might call for you to speak up, take a stand, make a request. You might have one already in your mind, but there may be others that will come this week, so be on the alert for that. So it's called the noticing exercise. And then just take a pause, and it may be a short pause, it may be a long pause, but notice, what is your inner chatter? Write it out. What, if you could write out the script, what is it saying? It's almost like you're distinguishing, you're taking a little distance away from yourself and observing yourself. If you want, you could name the inner critics, and you could call it a judger, you could call it the voice of doubt, but you could get creative and call it you're not ready enough, or who are you to think you can speak up. I mean, doing that helps you distinguish them. So having a little fun sounds silly, but it's actually a useful way to distinguish in our brains that these are different thoughts and they're not necessarily truth. And then ask yourself, well, what are the beliefs and thoughts and assumptions that are at play, and shall I challenge them? Is there something here that's true, or is it coming from the voice of limiting beliefs? Now, sometimes there is a little bit of truth, and that's okay, because then you could address that. But what an inner critic will do is exaggerate the fear and the limiting belief and hijack your better thinking. So it's not an all or none thing. And so you could ask yourself these questions on the right, that, what evidence do I have that these are true? And how does this perspective serve or not serve? And what's the potential ripple effect? Now, I'll tell you, if we were doing this with Max or with Anik or Joe, particularly Max, how does this perspective serve you, Max, or serve the organization? And he'd probably, because he's a bright guy, come to the conclusion that, I'm playing it small, and it's not about me, it's about the organization, it's about the board doing great work, it's about us all meeting our mandate and mission. And he might realize that playing it small is in fact not only unsafe, there's risks, there'll be time wasted, and it matters. What's the potential ripple effect, Joe? for you saying yes when you really know you're at your capacity, and she would probably realize that there's great risk in her failing in a much bigger way than in that one. So when you start to get that awareness by taking a few moments and just reflecting, and you could either, obviously when you're in a coaching conversation, you have somebody facilitating that for you, but if you could take some reflective time on your own and use these starting questions, you might then be holding some new awareness so that you could then make a choice what to do. Do I step up? Do I speak up? Do I say no? So that brings us to our next point, which is that is when you are you have the foundation now to decide, is this the time? And my intent is not for all of us to be standing up on every single thing. It's that we do need to use our judgment. A squeaky wheel need not squeak each and every time. You need to choose your spots. So, decide, is this the time? Does it matter enough? It is. There's a lot that can go into this kind of thinking, but what are those values and priorities that you set for yourself? And even if it is something about balance, is that valid? Do you feel that is valid for you to take a stand? But you also know that you have a role at the organization, and you need to decide on the priorities and values of the organization. And is it your job to really be, serving those and taking a stand? Do you know your boundaries? Because if you don't know your boundaries, it's very difficult to protect your boundaries. And so do you know your limitations? And so this is where you do get a chance to say, this is important and I will take a stand, or this isn't as important. I think I'll suck it up on this round. I'll let it go. Okay, so you get to be the choice maker. Now, before we go to the next one, I want to say that if you've come this far and you've done the awareness thing, you've navigated, noticed the difference between inner critics and voice of reason, and you've done some good thinking and you're able to make some good decisions, well, that's quite a ways forward, and that's awesome work. However, it's kind of like in a marathon. I used to be a marathon runner many, many, many years ago, and I remember those last 2 miles were the hardest. Really, really challenging. And so that's kind of where we are, if you will. There's still a couple more things to do in order for you to actually stand up. And so I don't want to minimize that. Sure, you might feel the conviction, and you might feel this is important, and you might feel the passion, and you might be clear in your mind, but geez, you still feel that fear. So I want to acknowledge that this is not about waiting until fear goes away, and those earlier steps don't necessarily guarantee that the fear goes away. Because what we need in order to harness your assertiveness ability and to grow it is to stretch it a little bit and step inside the fear. And what we do is we do that with courage. So a quick question to you is, I'd love to hear from the audience, Marina, is where do you get your courage? Let's hear from some people on where they get their courage.
That's a great question, Eileen. So let's see. One person said, I have no idea. That's an honest answer.
I love that. Yeah.
From past success.
Good.
From professional experience, from coworkers, or a friend or a spouse. Thinking about my mom, who braved a lot of challenges.
Right.
Yeah, knowing that my family and friends believe in me. Thinking about other role models.
Great.
Yeah. One person here says it's easier for me to stand up for other people as opposed to myself. So perhaps needing to draw on that. Yeah, lots and lots of ancestors, thinking about other important people in their life. Yeah, good.
Oh, super. Thank you. I love it. I wish we had 2 hours here. I'm always a little greedy. I would love to spend more time and dig into all of those. I actually earlier this year for the first time, I did a 3-hour workshop on courage. So it's a huge topic, and it's a really important topic. And I think each of you who spoke up and wrote these ideas are bringing wisdom forward that all of us can remember. And what's important is in the moment, it is really important to remember how to access your courage. And if it is thinking about a role model, if that works for you, then that's a phenomenal thing. But we need to remember to do that. And the challenge is when we're feeling threatened and nervous and fearful is our brain closes down. So whatever you can do to remind yourself that part of being assertive does indeed call for courage, and just ask yourself the question, what do I need to do to get some courage? And so thinking about past successes is phenomenal. Talking to somebody who might, shore you up, is reaching out to others is fantastic. And then what I want to acknowledge about courage is, this is a picture, some of you will recognize this picture from The Wizard of Oz. And if you haven't seen The Wizard of Oz, if you didn't grow up with it, it's a story of a group of characters that try to travel to the land of Oz and speak to this almighty wizard who they believe will give them what they need. And this is the lion, and he was wanting courage, and he traveled great lengths to go get some courage, and he was looking outside of himself for the courage. And in the course of the movie, if you haven't seen it, try to see if you can find it. It's a lovely parable and lovely story. But if you recall, for those of you that did see it, that what he discovered is the courage was there all the time. The whole time he had the courage. He just needed to remember to activate it. And it's one micro moment at a time. And so I want to remind you that you have it in you. And I've had many people come to me and say, I'm afraid to speak up on such and such. And we would talk about their fears. But then these are the very same people that I've met who came. I'm thinking of one gentleman in particular. He moved only a couple years prior from India to work in Canada all by himself, and he landed a job, he found a place to live and made a new life for himself. And that to me takes a great amount of courage. So we have courage, we just need to find new ways to access it in different contexts. So if you can remember that, what's needed is to tap into what's there already. And I like to quote Robert Biswas-Diener, who wrote about courage in his book, The Courage Quotient. Of all our basic virtues, courage is the one that helps us live exactly the way we want and provides the psychological fuel we need to create, take risks, help others, and face hard times. Courageous action is humanity at its finest. So I like to think of courage as fuel for the tank to help you get to, remember I used that metaphor, the last 2 miles of this exercise, to speak up, to fuel you to step forward and speak up. Another helpful tool, and I actually had this posted literally on my wall for a while. I was needing some courage for some stuff I was trying to do, and I felt a little scared about it. And it's simply asking yourself, am I capable of 5 seconds of courage right now? And many people have used this quote, but the first time I heard it was at a TEDx Toronto talk, and Drew Dudley, who was the MC, voiced that, and so I attribute him because that's where I heard it first. So, whatever you need to remind yourself to ask yourself the question, you do not need permanent 3-hour, if the meeting's 3 hours, you don't necessarily need 3 hours of courage. You don't need 24 hours of courage. You just need a micro moment to step up, and chances are from there you'll find what else you need. Okay, so we're on our last bit, and I'm going to dive into that in a quick second, but I just want to acknowledge we've got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to share with people, this is a 1-hour webinar, and I know that we're probably we're going to go a little over when it comes to the Q&As at the end, and I know Marina said generously that that would be okay, and what we'll do is we'll tape it. So for those of you that want to stay on a bit longer live, please do, and for those that do have to leave in 10 minutes when this is over, know that we'll be just carrying on a little bit further with the Q&As, and that will be available to you in the tape. Okay, let's get now finally to the words, okay? Now again, I could spend another hour or a day with you to try to share with you all the different ideas of how to frame things and how to say things, and I do have a lot of those ideas. But again, I don't know that we'd be able to do that in this introductory webinar, nor will it serve you as well. So what I'd like to do is I will have a few ideas and words and thoughts. I have a few slides coming up. But this is a piece that comes from conversational intelligence. It's a nice acronym. It's the TRUST acronym that is useful to remember as you think about the words when you have to take a stand and have a conversation. And it stands for transparency, relationship, understanding, sharing success, and testing assumptions. So transparency is about you being authentic. Remember, taking a stand means you need to bring your authentic self. You need to speak up, just like Joe needed to say, I think I'm a little bit at capacity, but let's have a conversation. Relationship is about really recognizing the person on the other side, or the group of people on the other side of the conversation. It's never just about your needs. It's never just about I and an I-centric. It's always we. And it's never just about the transactional issue that you need to speak up. There's very much a we orientation in how you need to frame your words. Understanding is choosing your words carefully, and also you're listening so that you promote a good chance that they will understand you, and that you need to listen to understand others. And then sharing success, so it's never just about bulldozing and trying to make it all about your win. And testing assumptions is, remember, everybody, we all walk in with assumptions, and it's a good idea to have conversations about what assumptions people are holding. It's not a bad thing. It's just understanding to make sure that you're on the same page. So that could frame, this is a little bit, it comes from the conversational intelligence side of things, and that is, having healthy dynamics so that your conversations have better chances of having a positive impact and healthier dynamics. So again, how do you create a safe environment when you need to speak up? How do you be more transparent? How do you establish rapport? How do you prime others to be open? How do you step in other people's shoes? And on and on. I spoke a little bit of that, to that in the earlier slide. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into that. A few helpful distinctions. Make requests, not demands. Clarify and don't muddle. Sometimes people will hint or be a little bit passive aggressive, and I probably should have had a slide on that, but in an hour it's hard to do it all. But sometimes we muddle things by just burying what we need to say and hinting and hope people will get it. We need to speak directly, and that's clarify. Enroll people and don't enforce things. Enroll. Initiate. Don't wait, and that would be good advice for Anik, who needed to initiate the conversation about her interest in the role. And respect, don't neglect other people's needs. So there's a lot around this, of course, but here's a few quick ideas. In Joe's case, if you need to say no, don't just say, no, I can't, but maybe make another offer. While I don't have the time to chair that committee, I could offer up some ideas. Would that be of help? Come from a place of responsibility. Joe could say, I understand the importance of this and know that, this assignment is really important, but to take this on, I'd have to delay other work. And then enroll, and if it's coming from your boss, you could say, are you okay with that, or should we ask someone else, or how would you like to, reallocate the work? And that is really a responsible conversation, and her boss would probably appreciate that and be and actually know that good, she's got good judgment, and they could then have a conversation and figure stuff out. In Max's case, respect that everybody has important contributions and appreciate where everybody's coming from, but ask them if they'd be willing to listen, they'd be open to hearing another perspective, and share that he has one as well. And so that he doesn't have to worry about putting down other people's ideas or going right into the no, that won't work. There's a lot we need to do to say, listen, these are all great ideas and they contribute to good thinking, and it's important that we all feel safe to speak. I have another perspective, and ask for their permission. Would you be willing to hear it? And in fact, I'm just going to jump ahead to the prime for listening. Asking people and saying, would you be willing to hear me out on another perspective, rather than jumping into your perspective, primes people to give you this, that there's an alternate view. It's a great way to start a conversation. Would you be willing to hear another idea? And often what people think they have to do is launch right into their reasons. Well, that project won't work. This is what we need to do. And that does offend other people, and that does put people on the defensive, okay? So I know there's a lot more we can get into The be direct in enrolling, as I said, very important not to hint. And so in Anique's case, she could say, I'd like to make a request that you consider me as a candidate for that role. How do you feel about that? And get some input. Do you think that would be appropriate? But she's clear about it. And I think the clearer and direct we could be, but without being blunt. Okay, so there's a lot of artfulness around this and a lot of practice. And of course, trying to share success. Of course, the tone and the facial expressions and the pace and your own listening are incredibly important and just important to all of this. And so I know that we actually did a full hour on this last year. It was called Supercharge Your Listening Skills. And so I know that Marina can make that available. Again, by all means, you guys could listen to that. It's in the archives. That is just as important. And so I think I'd love almost to take, as I said, so much more time to build on all that. But in the hour that we had today, what I want to just say is that I've given you a framework. I've given you some starting ideas. And I'd invite you to really practice these steps of building your awareness and noticing your moments, discerning between your voice of inner critics and your voice of good judgment, not judging, but good judgment. Picking your spots and practicing courage by reminding yourself that you do have it, finding ways, and then practice the artfulness of how you express it. There were a few ideas that I offered to try to always acknowledge people and to think about the we and not the I, and there's much more, of course, available. Pick your spots, practice in the week ahead, set an intention, and know that with practice, it gets better. So it's one conversation at a time. Refine it. Pick one thing, set an intention, and practice and refine. And then, write out what you learned, what you're still stuck on, and then with practice, you will develop more fluency. As I mentioned, there's so much to both these topics, and I'd be delighted to see you in my community. Feel free to sign up for my webinar, my newsletter. Join me on Twitter, and I hope we have other opportunities to take the conversation further. I would like to open it up now. I know I gave a lot of information, and yet I probably opened up your minds or ideas to wanting so much more. I acknowledge that this was an introduction for 1 hour, but let's take some time now, Marina, do you think, for some questions?
Sure, that would be great, Eileen. So let's get started with, if you are someone who habitually has said yes, so you've been addicted to that yes habit, how do you start to reverse that without necessarily impacting how you're being received in a negative way?
Okay, so we'll reinforce that one. That's a really good one. So it goes back to the noticing game. So if you notice that you're always addicted to yes, and you're very quick to say yes, it's a good idea to pause. And sometimes if you, for instance, get a request in an email, then you have a built-in pause. And take that pause and ask yourself, what is my instinct here? Do I need to think this through? Is there a reason that I would want to say no, and walk through the steps that we talked about earlier about noticing and discerning what's driving you to say yes, and what are the reasons to say no, and is this the time? Is this the time I need to say no? I do not want you all walking away from today's meeting and saying no to everything that comes your way. To practice, part of the practice is to, if you recall, to discern and to decide. So if you get an email request, you have the time to do that, and you need to slow down your own impulse to answer quickly. Now, sometimes you might have a conversation and somebody might say, can you do such and such? And it might even be in your personal life. And, sometimes we could buy ourselves some time. And you can say, listen, I really appreciate that request, and I know it's really important. Can I just get back to you, because I know I have a really big load, but I just want to take a look at what's on deck already, and I just want to circle back so I could be responsible about managing my workload so that if I say yes, that I can do it well, or whatever. Can I just get back to you on that? So sometimes you can buy yourself some time. But again, it's not a quick yes or no. It's walk yourself through these steps and make the decision. Is it your voice of impulse and fear making you say yes, or is there a good enough reason for you to say no? You might need a little courage. And then don't just say no. Think about how to say it in a way that says, acknowledges the other person. And thank you for asking me. I appreciate that you came to me, and I appreciate it's an important task. I would really like to do that, and I'm just not quite sure yet if I have the capacity to do it well. So always acknowledge and be thoughtful in your answer, and watch the tone and the words and how you say no, because no is fine. It's how you say no.
Great. And we've had this question come up quite a few times. If you've attempted to be assertive, for instance, using your example of saying no, you can't take on a particular task, but what if you don't get the outcome that you were looking for? Do you have tips on how to handle that?
It's a really tough one to kind of answer in terms of you know, a one-size-fits-all, because it really depends on your situation. And so you know, if I were coaching somebody and they came to me with that situation, I would explore, tell me what you did say to that person. What is your understanding of why, or what is your thinking about why they're saying no? And I would really seek to understand more about the situation. There are times when people cannot, when certain things need to be done, but the way you have the conversation to enroll the other, if there is a situation where you are at risk of failing other parts of your workload, but you haven't communicated that, and all you've done is just keep asking, I need more time, I can't do this, but you haven't responsibly and authentically communicated what's at stake here, then the person that you're making the request doesn't have all the information. And often I end up discovering that when we get into a deeper conversation with somebody, that you may not have communicated in a way that there's genuine understanding, or you may not have an understanding about what's really at stake. And so that's where conversational intelligence is not about you trying to win at all. It is not about you trying to get your way. It is about you having a conversation with the other person so that you both can understand what is at stake. You could both understand and you could work things out and hopefully find a way. But if you can't find a way, because sometimes you can't, at least you leave with a better understanding, and nothing is, the relationship is still in good stead. And so that's what conversational intelligence is about. It's not about winning, it's about being understood both ways. I hope that helps.
That's a great distinction. Yeah, that's excellent. How about some practical tips on how to have courage in the moment? We have Alicia who comments that she likes to have a glass of water on hand so she can take a pause, take a sip, collect herself if there's a difficult conversation, which seems to help her. Are there other things that you could suggest kind of along those lines?
Absolutely. So first of all, that little tool that I said, what would I do if I could muster up 5 seconds of courage? I'll tell you why that is a great tool with the glass of water. Taking a pause, whether it be a pause, taking a 5-minute walk, but asking yourself a question. It could be the courage question, or it could be another question. Is when you ask yourself a question like that, you're actually inviting your higher thinking brain back online. When you're feeling fearful, your fear brain has taken over, and your higher thinking brain and your fear brain, your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex, do not work together. It's one or the other. So if you pause and you either ask yourself a question, what would courage look like now? And it's not forcing yourself into courage, but in a very genuine, curious way. I wonder what courage would look like now. You're asking your prefrontal cortex to get into some cognitive activity, and it actually starts to calm yourself down, because it does like to think in that way, in a positive way. Now, another thing you can do is, I teach my clients now, this is something new, I didn't do it a few years ago, but I'm increasingly doing it. I'm teaching them these 3-minute meditations, and you can find that through HeartMath. It's called Quick Coherence. And learning to breathe and breathe through your heart and focus can calm down the immediate fears and the immediate nerves, so that you could access your heart intelligence and access the wisdom that most of you already have, all of you have, but many of you did already start to acknowledge ways to tap into courage. Because what we do need to do is we need to calm down, get into a place of coherence before we could tap into that intelligence. And so there's so many ways, and remember, you don't need a ton of courage, you just need a little bit to make the first move, if you will. So breathing, calming down first, and then asking yourself a question, is a good starting point.
Great. And for those that were asking the question about how to avoid possibly getting a little bit emotional or maybe even a bit teary, I assume that kind of speaks to that as well.
Yeah, you don't want to go in while you're feeling all that emotion, because it will be hard to bring that higher thinking brain and bring that voice of wisdom to you. You do want to try to calm down a little bit. That said, it's easy to trigger, it's easy to trigger it again. One of the things that I find really helpful, and of course it really depends on every situation, but authenticity really matters. And I know even for myself, I've had some really tough conversations, but if I've said to the person, I apologize, but I'm feeling a little stressed about this, and if you see it in my face, it's not intentional, but it's how I'm feeling, and I'd really like to have a conversation about this such and such, because it really matters to me. And I don't think you need to. Emotional intelligence is not about hiding emotions. We don't want you walking into a meeting crying. We do need you to self-manage as best as you can. But what is important is harnessing the emotions and appropriately being authentic. It's okay to say, I feel very strongly about this, and I might feel, I might be appearing a little distraught, and I don't mean to be unprofessional. I really want to have a conversation about this, but I'm feeling a bit distraught because it's very important that we get this project on track, and I feel such and such, or whatever. Or, I'm giving examples that are a little random here, but my point is it is okay to acknowledge and even give voice to your emotion, and that is part of the spectrum of emotional intelligence and assertiveness. So if somebody will say that, I have an idea that I feel quite strongly about, and I know that we have lots of ideas on the table, but I really feel strongly that I'd at minimum like to be heard. It means a lot to me, and I care about this a lot, and it would mean a great deal to me if you could at least, allow me to voice it and at least give consideration to it, because I feel strongly about it. So it's okay to speak to your emotions. What you want to just do is harness them productively. And so that's the piece. And then, of course, doing the breathing before you go into a meeting will help. Of course, the triggering during the meeting, do your best to breathe, do your best to try to remember the distinction between being professional and letting it all out.
That's great, Eileen. And I think we'll end on this question here. We've had a few self-identified younger professionals on the call
those
today.
millennials.
Yeah, which is great. And even I think probably some Gen Z folks on the call today. Yeah. So do you have any specific tips for younger professionals who might be struggling with this a little bit, and might even be dealing with leaders who are a little bit maybe older and more established and are carrying a little bit of confidence, I'll say, with them because of
yes. Absolutely. I remember when I was starting out, and I remember this, I felt so intimidated where I was. I was at a very big PR international agency. I could not believe I got the job, and I was feeling extremely timid, and I wasn't very assertive back then, or quite as assertive as I am now. And so part of the confidence does come over time. As you get more comfortable in your roles, you will the confidence does come with practice. And as I mentioned, and I want to reinforce to the listeners here, this courage piece, which is part of assertiveness, I told you I did a 3-hour workshop because there really is a lot. And one of the messages that I forgot to mention or didn't get to mention today is that courage does build. And the more you practice what we've talked about today, your courage will build. It's just like the assertiveness muscle, the courage builds. But what I want to say to the younger people on the call who are starting out and might feel there's a built-in kind of like a hierarchy, if you will, more experienced people might inherently have more confidence, and the lesser. you know, it really is an equal playing field. This business of assertiveness, I have seen people who are very senior level who don't have a lot of assertiveness and courage to speak up. And then I've seen some, I work with a lot of young people these days because you're all getting the keys to the kingdom and you're the ones that are coming and knocking at my door for the coaching. And I have met some incredible young people who have beautifully shown the potential and even the abilities to take stands appropriately so that they do get promoted and they do get the plum assignments. So you do not need to wait until you're at a certain level. You just need to know how to pick your spots. So it might be making a request to take on a piece of a project. It might be speaking up and saying, I have an idea about something. Would you be willing to hear me out? It might contribute to the project. It might be making a request. It is, in fact, your time to make sure that you are in the driver's seat of your career. We're not talking about bullying yourself through your career trajectory, but it will be, do not wait like Anik waited. Do not wait to be tapped on the shoulder. It is you that needs to take those stands and have the conversations and show appreciation for your opportunities, but do let the people who are influencers know that you are looking for experience to grow and you are ready to step it up. And if they need any, if they have opportunities for you to do more, you'd like to. That is assertiveness. Assertiveness happens one conversation at a time. And they will see you as initiative, they will see you as confident, they will see you as able. As long as you do that in a way that is not aggressive, not bullying, that has the integrity. And so as go back to that emotional intelligence kind of picture, there's a whole realm of skills so that you do it right. And of course, conversational intelligence primes for healthy conversational dynamics, not bullying, not demanding, but rather making requests, not demands. I hope that's helpful.
That's great, Eileen. I think we're going to leave it there with questions, but I want to thank you again. You've once again given us many great tools for our toolbox to get started with this, and I think probably all of us here today, like you said, can learn from that. So it's been wonderful having you present for us again.
I thank you and I thank the community. It's an amazing community. So thank you so much. And those were great questions. Thank you, everybody.
Great. So before we sign off today, I'm just going to remind you that we're going to follow up by email tomorrow with the webinar recording, of course. There will also be the short survey. It takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. I hope that you'll consider doing that for us. You will have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see us cover in a future session also. We are going to be wrapping up our Day in the Life series of webinars next week, actually, on June 7th. We're going to have leadership coach Janice Cunning with us. She's going to be discussing how to rediscover your personal values and how that can help lead to a more fulfilling career and even perhaps tie in a bit to the assertiveness stuff that we've covered today. So if you're interested in that, we will have a registration link in that email that we're going to send out to you tomorrow also. So with that, I want to thank all of you again for taking the time to join us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.